Okay, my name is Brianna Self. I'm from the USA, and I'm a student at Brigham Young University. I'm studying German and history, focusing particularly on the Holocaust. And I, as my colleague, talked a lot about anti-fascist films already. I also have written this presentation about anti-fascist films, but rather the GDR's perspective. So all of these films are focused within the GDR, and as the field of anti-fascist films is very, very big, I focus particularly on how the concentration camp was demonstrated and presented in these DEFA films. So, in late 1954, the German Democratic Republic citizen and state employee Bruno Apitz submitted a proposal for a film about the last days of the Holocaust, or Buchenwald, and the rescue of a young Jewish boy from the perils of a concentration camp. Despite Apitz's position as a contracted author for DEFA at the time, the film was rejected. 4 years after Apitz's rejected submission for a DEFA screenplay, he released the same basic story, but now as a novel. Apitz saw almost immediate success. Within 6 months of its publication, 5 editions of the book were published, with another 4 the following year, resulting in a total of nearly 180,000 copies sold within the first years of its publication. Before 1962, Naked Among Wolves had been translated into 17 languages. The novel's profound success sparked a radio reading of the book in the fall of 1958. And then 2 years later, the first on-screen adaptation was released as a Fernsehspiel, or a television play, in 1960. Over the next 20 years, Leopold's adaptation was then rebroadcasted about 20 times, with 5 of those rebroadcasts within a 5-year span. With the growing phenomenon that began to surround Naked Among Wolves, DEFA was only too keen to bring Apitz's story to the cinema screen, and did so in 1963. The ultimate success of the novel, radio program, television film, and the DEFA production versions of Naked Among Wolves came only through their timely emergence, but also because of the important myth-building story. The phenomenon of Naked Among Wolves in the 1950s and early 60s demonstrates not only the evolution of GDR anti-fascist propaganda through film, but also how governmental attitudes and agenda influence Holocaust memorialization, both in the mid-1900s and today. From the end of the war until the mid-1960s within the GDR, the concentration camp was a taboo subject for GDR media. Even blatant anti-fascist films avoided concentration camps, as Professor Mamluk did. The DEFA claimed that a film set in the concentration camp could not be used as anti-Western propaganda, and that East Germans of the day needed uplifting, forward-looking socialist films, not depressing ones about Buchenwald. By the mid-1950s, the SED, or the East German ruling political party, moved past the shame of the concentration camp, realizing instead Buchenwald's potential in creating a foundational myth in communist East Germany. Although not the first DEFA film to address the concentration camp, the direct attention and setting and filming of Naked Among Wolves in Buchenwald mirrored the GDR's plan to memorialize and reconstruct the narrative of the concentration camp. I argue that the timing of Naked Among Wolves' release, its setting and storyline within Buchenwald, and its intense success placed it as a representative culmination of concentration camp memorialization in the GDR. To truly understand how revolutionary the Naked Among Wolves phenomenon was, a quick background on how concentration camps were previously addressed in GDR films is necessary. Films like the 1961 The Murderers Are Among Us and the 1950 Council of the Gods passively addressed 2 forms of mass killing used in the Holocaust. In both films, however, the concentration camp was only the background story to the main plot. While A Diary of Anne Frank in 1958 brought viewers inside the concentration camp for the first time, the intent in doing so was to cast light on the actions of Nazi officers and to serve as a call of action against the refascistization occurring in West Germany. Stars Stars' relatively positive story, an ending message of resistance to Nazi ideology as a reaction to the knowledge of what occurred in the concentration camp, contributed to the early stages of GDR's foundational myth. Stars and A Diary for Anne Frank served as platforms to test the use of concentration camps as means of propaganda and political persuasion. These tests, however, became vaulting grounds for the process and eventual success of Naked Among Wolves. My interest for Naked Among Wolves came after an introduction to the 2015 German remake of the film. After digging into the history behind this film a little bit further, I learned that Bill Niven's book, The Buchenwald Child, Truth, Fiction, and Propaganda, is the only book that's been written about Naked Among Wolves. And it's a severely understudied category in film, especially for its significance within the field. In the midst of literature about Holocaust memory, about East and West Germany, it's surprising how little attention this film has received, and that's why I decided to study it a little bit further. Naked Among Wolves is the story of a 3-year-old Jewish boy who in the last months of the war was smuggled into the Buchenwald concentration camp by his father, a Polish Jew, and then protected and hidden by his fellow inmates and capos who were also members of the underground communist resistance movement. After using the young boy as a blackmail against the Nazis soldiers with the imminent American liberation, the young boy and the Kapo's communist resistance fighters were set free at the end of the war. While this GDR narrative of communist resistance heroes is far from unique, its direct setting in concentration camps, along with the huge popularity the story quickly received, distinguishes it as the culmination of this change in concentration camp memorialization. Following the end of any real hope of reunification in 1952 and following the end of any real hope of reunification in 1952 to 1953, the SED desperately searched to provide its citizens with some level of national identification and therefore legitimacy. Based on the foundation that West Germany was overrun by fascists, the SED began establishing what scholars with Bill Niven call the foundational myth. Niven explains that by contrasting the anti-fascist prehistory and traditions of the GDR with supposed anti-fascist continualities in the West, the SED could argue that GRD had more right to be recognized as the true Germany than the FRG did. After 1958, with the efforts of the SED in memorializing Buchenwald, the concentration camp had become a key symbolic site in the GDR. And it was this symbolic site was in the ways of the history of anti-fascism and used as a weapon in the re-fascistization in the West. Instead of a symbol of death and suffering, Buchenwald became a symbol of socialism's uplifting and inspiring nature amongst the most difficult conditions, and a manifestation of the GDR's loyalty to the spirits of the resistance legacy. The hesitant but growing acceptance of concentration camps in DEFA films was a process. Although Oppitz's story is typical of DEFA films and its oversimplification of the Jewish question and its overarching storyline of communist self-liberation, it was fundamental in building the GDR's foundational myth. Ignoring the young boy's Jewish heritage, the communist resistance, and ultimate self-liberation is the main theme of the story. And placing a story of communist resistance and self-liberation inside Buchenwald, it created an image of rising from the ashes. The German communist movement rose from the horrors of Nazi concentration and death camps, despite the suppression of an already terribly painted regime. In both the 1960 television film and the 1963 DEFA film, Naked Among Wolves, as the self-liberation narrative gathered momentum, the young boy is hidden by prisoners in the pigsty. Once the camp is liberated, the former prisoners bring him out, wash him of the pigsty filth, and raise him above their shoulders as a trophy in a moment of victory. This raising up of a young Jewish boy symbolized not only the victory over Nazism, but the championship and greatness of communism. While previous films had only lightly addressed the concentration camps, Naked Among Wolves addressed them head-on, directly through its storyline. When asked what provoked Frank Bayer, the director of the 1963 DEFA film, into making a film of the story that had already been a popular book and television film, Bayer responded, "We do not have a single DEFA film which, from the standpoint of a fighting communist, has dealt with the nature of the concentration camp. DEFA's acceptance of Appitz's story confirmed the shift towards using concentration camps to project a message that took place within overall GDR anti-fascist policies. As tensions were high between East and West Germany, as the Berlin Wall was built in August of 1961, Bayer and Appitz began writing the screenplay for the 1963 adaptation. Niven notes that Bayer and Appitz felt renewed pressure to produce a film that would not only display the communist role in resistance, but also exemplify the separation between East and West Germany. The construction of the Berlin Wall led to a renewed desire to establish the GDR identity as different and superior to the East, again using Buchenwald as a setting in that story. Naked Among Wolves demonstrates not only how the overall negative connotations surrounding concentration camps changed through the phenomenon, but also within the film itself. From the gray, horrifying images at the start of the film to the positive, victorious ending scene, Georg Leopold's 1960 gravely black and white television film demonstrates the shift in attitudes during the late 1950s and early 60s. Viewers first saw a train passing through, belching out heavy black smoke as the image fades to that of Buchenwald's crematorium, with smoke to match the train. Dead bodies were dragged across the roll call area just as the camera zooms in on the face of a dying man, slouched against the gates of the concentration camp, with the sound of Nazi soldiers yelling in the background. These horrifying images were contrasted by the narrative of resistance, rescue, and survival and ultimate self-liberation that followed throughout this scene. This mirrored the narrative of the SED that the SED hoped to create about the concentration camps. As Niven argues, Leopold's film describes the journey from annihilation to victory. Despite the earlier television film and its subsequent reruns on the GDR television, the release of Frank Bayer's DEFA feature film, Naked Among Wolves in 1963, was certainly well-timed. Within the first 13 weeks of its release, it was seen by an audience of well over 500,000. Certainly, the celebration of the GDR's foundational myth and the triumph of communism over fascism was far from irrelevant. Despite being favored to win gold, Naked Among Wolves won a silver medal at the 1963 International Moscow Film Festival. Appitz Bayer and the art director Alfred Hirschmeyer and cinematographer Günther Makowski received the National Prize of East Germany, first degree, for their work on Naked Among Wolves. Leopold and Bayer's adaptations went on to be released in theaters across the globe, and however short-lived, Bayer's adaptation was even shown in West Germany. Ultimately, the Naked Among Wolves phenomenon found success not only simply as a film and propaganda, but also in epitomizing the memorialization of these concentration camps. For 11 years after Bayer's adaptation of Naked Among Wolves, DEFA again devoted little significant attention to the Second World War's concentration camps. The release of Jakob der Lügner, or Jacob the Liar, also directed by Frank Bayer in 1964, was the story of a Jewish man, Jakob, who gave hope to his fellow prisoners in the Lutz ghetto in 1944 by falsifying good news about the war that had supposedly heard on the radio. The fear and eventual deportation to a concentration camp or death camp lingered in the film, but was never realized through Jakob der Lügner. David's Tagebuch, or David's Journal, in 1980, follows the story recorded in a journal of a young boy, David, who lived in a small Polish village before the journal abruptly ends, signaling the boy's deportation to the death camp Treblinka. These films, while not ignoring the horrors of the concentration camp, reverted to their former reputation as locations of death, pain, and horror. Naked Among Wolves, however, used the Buchenwald concentration camp to remind its viewers that while Nazis performed horrible deeds in the camps, they were also places of communist resistance where communist ideals could prevail. While these films, along with those raised before and after Naked Among Wolves phenomenon, do work to expose the concentration camps for what they were during the war, none encapsulated the GDR's vision of concentration camp memorialization as a tool to promote communist ideals as well as Naked Among Wolves did. Thank you.